court document reveals criminal charges against Julian Assange.
The exact charges might involve the Espionage Act.
To charge someone for publishing truthful information.
Disclosures made by Wikileaks and the New York Times and the Guardian.
Julian Assange has deeply embarrassed US intelligence. I think they would dearly love to see him in court.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. Rumor becomes fact. Julian Assange is in America's crosshairs. We examine the case for and against WikiLeaks and its journalism. Not content to control the narrative in the news media, the Kremlin turns its eyes towards Russian cinema and what it's saying. Mark Zuckerberg is blaming the media for some of Facebook's problems. He might want to focus a little closer to home.
And then, of course, there's Donald Trump.
And it's the end of the White House Correspondents' Dinner as we know it. Sort of. We begin with Julian Assange and a news peg like no other. Last week, in court papers filed in the U.S. in a case completely unrelated to the WikiLeaks founder, there was a paragraph confirming that a secret indictment has been filed against Assange. Prosecutors called it an administrative mistake, meaning a supposed clerical error confirmed something that Assange had always feared, but that the U.S. Department of Justice had never admitted. It wants him in jail. It's been more than 6 years now since Assange was granted asylum at the Ecuadorian Embassy in London. An investigation into sexual assault-related allegations made by 2 women in Sweden has long since been dropped. But British police say that Assange will be arrested the moment he steps out of that embassy for breach of bail. Less than a decade ago, Julian Assange had media outlets eating out of his hand and governments with secrets to hide on high alert. Now he's at the mercy of an Ecuadorian government that's running out of patience, and he may be running out of time. Our starting point this week is a court document and a revelation never meant to see the light of day. Of all the twists and turns in the Assange story, the initial deluge of classified documents WikiLeaks published, the resulting headlines, the sexual assault-related allegations made in Sweden, the irregularities surrounding those cases, the self-imposed exile on Ecuadorian territory in London, and the 6-year-long waiting game since, this may be the oddest twist of all. A clerical error, a sloppy case of cut and paste that appears to justify Julian Assange's concerns about having to face justice, American style.
There's nothing like a cock-up to make the truth come to light. So, there was a filing on a completely unrelated and not very high-profile case in the Eastern District of Virginia, and they had copy and pasted a section from another indictment. And so this indictment about some totally random guy ended up mentioning Julian Assange. What they haven't said is what the charges are and what period of WikiLeaks activity they relate to.
The clerical error took place at a court in Alexandria, Virginia, right next door to Washington, where a grand jury has reportedly been investigating Julian Assange since 2010.
It will shape an understanding of what the past 6 years of war has been like.
Back then, WikiLeaks was in its heyday. The Iraq and Afghan war logs revealed brutal truths about those invasions, confirming war crimes previously denied by the Pentagon. The diplomatic cables would later expose America's duplicity in its dealings with foreign governments. WikiLeaks was partnering with news organizations, heavy hitters like the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde in France, making headlines around the world. By the end of 2010, Le Monde named Julian Assange its Person of the Year. Time magazine's readers did the same, and Rolling Stone called him Rock Star of the Year. Barack Obama's Vice President Joe Biden had another term for Assange, high-tech terrorist.
If you go and challenge and threaten and undermine the world's most powerful institutions, as WikiLeaks has done, they are going to impose on you retaliation. There was actually a 2008 U.S. Army report that described WikiLeaks as an enemy of the state and talked about different ways that they could destroy the organization. And we can read about that document because, ironically, it got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on its own website.
The left was very excited about WikiLeaks and excited about the fact that things that governments had traditionally kept secret were no longer going to be kept secret.
Light them all up. Come on, fire!
It seemed to be part of this whole new wave of nothing is secret anymore in the age of the internet.
They fear a domino effect. They realize that inside the US intelligence community, there are many people who have seen all sorts of abuses. They are terrified that there could be 100 Chelsea Manning, 1,000 Edward Snowden. They cannot kill Julian Assange. So all they can do is use legal cases against Julian Assange and Wikileaks, which they have done.
In 2010, a legal case was opened against Assange in Sweden for sexual assault, based on the testimonies of 2 women. He denied the allegations and asked to be questioned in London, a common practice in such cases. He said he feared that going to Sweden could lead to an extradition to the US. The Swedes initially refused, but eventually interviewed him at the Ecuadorian Embassy in 2016, 6 years after the investigation began. Then the Swedes dropped the case without ever laying charges, a basic fact that seemed lost on news organizations.
The legal situation for yourself in Sweden, you're now facing charges.
I'm not going to talk about that.
Do you think Sweden will reactivate the rape charges, the 2 charges that were against him?
Despite the Swedes closing the case, the UK says it will arrest Assange if he steps out of the embassy for breaching his bail conditions. It's a standoff the UN calls a case of arbitrary detention, a denial of Assange's human rights. Stefania Morizzi is an investigative journalist who has probed how the Assange case has been conducted in both Sweden and the UK.
Thanks to my Freedom of Information Act request in Sweden, it was possible to reveal the crucial role of the UK authorities in creating this legal and diplomatic quagmire. For example, advising the Swedish prosecutors to question Julian Assange only after his extradition to Sweden. They write, "Please do not think that the case is being dealt with as just another extradition request." The press was running some stories like Sweden could drop case, says Assange, and the UK authorities wrote to the Swedish prosecutors, "Don't you dare get cold feet."
Even Julian Assange's supporters concede that WikiLeaks' practices can be contentious, such as publishing material without redactions. The Afghan war logs revealed the names of Afghans who had worked as informants for the invading coalition, placing them at risk of retaliation. The Saudi cables, released in 2015, contained the personal details of scores of Saudi civilians, including their medical records. And Julian Assange's decision to publish material during the 2016 US election campaign, emails from inside the Clinton team, hacked by persons unknown, but that US intelligence agencies say came via Russia, damaged WikiLeaks' journalistic standing and infuriated anti-Trump voices in America.
It's true that Julian Assange used to be a lot more popular before somebody undermined American democracy with the help of the Russians and gave us this president who is destroying democracy in the United States and threatening the entire world. I don't see Assange as a victim anymore. I see Assange as someone who helped to victimize American democracy. And if Julian Assange is being demonized for that, then count me among his demonizers.
Conversations that we've been able to read that have been leaked seem to be suggesting that Julian would be willing to do things specifically to help the Trump campaign. Certainly, that's a legitimate critique of WikiLeaks that I think we can all see evidence for. What we've never seen any evidence for is that there's been any even communication, let alone collaboration or cooperation between WikiLeaks and the Russian government, even though for some reason it's now totally acceptable in Western media outlets to simply assert as though it's fact.
Julian Assange has said the source of the Clinton emails was not the Russian government, nor was it a state party. Assange also has issues with his new landlord. The Ecuadorian president who granted him asylum, Rafael Correa, has been succeeded by Lenin Moreno, who wants better relations with Washington. The new government hasn't evicted Assange, but his internet connection, his communications with the outside world are now controlled by the embassy. With his health reportedly failing, the lack of sunlight getting to him, Julian Assange cannot even go to a hospital for fear of being arrested. And Assange also has cause to feel aggrieved by the same news outlets that once feasted on the material that he handed to them on a plate. Not unlike his Ecuadorian hosts, many of those news organizations have turned against him.
If you are in the embassy of a country, you should probably try and be a good house guest. He's also, on multiple times, acted against Ecuador's diplomatic interests. He picked a fight with Spain, which is sort of one of their key European allies. He interfered in the US election, and so in the end they will find something to get him out. Or Assange's patience will crack and he'll try and make a break for it.
Whatever you think of Julian, whatever you think of WikiLeaks, what has been done to him over the last 6 to 7 years is a very sustained, serious, and deliberate violation of his basic liberties. And yet that has been almost entirely disregarded by the Western media. Instead, the attempt is to make you view him with such disdain and contempt. It's incredibly insidious because what they're doing is essentially the dirty work of those who are violating Julian Assange's rights, being turned over to the US government, being prosecuted for journalism, for publishing documents, has always been his principal worry, and it ought to be the worry of anyone who does journalism anywhere in the world.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Tariq Nuffa. Tariq, last week, the New York Times produced an investigative piece on Facebook, some of the questionable tactics the company has been using to go after its critics. What did that piece actually reveal?
Primarily that Facebook hired a PR firm called Definers, a company with strong links to the US Republican Party, to produce negative news coverage on not just its competitors like Apple and Google, but also the platform's critics, including billionaire investor George Soros. Soros has become a bit of a whipping boy for right-wing voices and anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists, given that he is liberal and Jewish. After Soros described Facebook as a menace to society in a speech at the beginning of this year, the Times reported that Definers sent a document to news outlets, attempting to link him to an organization called Freedom from Facebook. The company's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, and its COO, Sheryl Sandberg, both denied knowing that Definers was targeting Soros, and that's what CNN zeroed in on when it interviewed Zuckerberg last week.
This is a common tactic used by anti-Semitic and alt-right groups. That's why I think people were so shocked when they found out about this. I think that was one of the parts of the report that a lot of folks had real questions about. Does that strike you as stooping low?
Yeah, I wasn't particularly happy about that piece of it. And that's certainly a big part of when I read about this, what made me want to look into this more deeply.
So it's one of those what did the CEO know and when did he know it stories. Zuckerberg's also laying the blame for the hiring of this PR firm on others, isn't he?
Yes, specifically his communications team, which is led by Elliot Schrage. Facebook published an internal memo written by Schrage in which he admits he did hire Definers. His memo reads, "Did we ask them to do work on George Soros?" To which the answer is yes. And he adds, "It would be irresponsible and unprofessional of us not to understand the backgrounds and potential conflicts of interest of our critics." So Schrage is carrying the can for Zuckerberg on this, which is convenient since he already announced earlier this year that he's leaving the company.
Okay, thanks, Tariq. At a recent gathering of world leaders in Paris, the French President Emmanuel Macron talked about nationalism, saying that it was the exact opposite of patriotism. Many assumed he was speaking indirectly to Donald Trump and to Vladimir Putin. However, patriotism is something that Putin lays claim to. He describes it as a central tenet of today's Russia, and then relies on nationalistic rhetoric to boost morale and shore up his political base. And not just on the television airwaves, on the silver screen as well. While Russia's been criticized over its annexation of Crimea in 2014, alleged election meddling in the US and spy poisoning in the UK, the cinematic treatment of the contemporary Russia story is somewhat different. Crimea, for instance, is the stuff of rom-coms. Russia's history on the battlefield and in the world of sports is a heroic and triumphant tale. The Kremlin not only backs those films to the tune of millions of rubles, it clamps down on filmmakers it calls anti-state and bans their work. The Listening Post's Layli Faroudi now on the cinematic effort to produce patriotism in Russia.
Грандиозный проект и грандиозный успех. Открыта автомобильная часть моста через Керченский пролив.
May 2018, Russian broadcasters struck a triumphant tone in their reports on the completion of the bridge connecting Russia to Crimea, the Ukrainian region annexed by Russia.
Еще сильнее, а всех нас еще ближе друг к другу.
And earlier this month, viewers were treated to the same message on a bigger screen.
Welcome to the Crimsky Bridge.
The biggest bridge in Russia.
Это патриотическая комедия о том, что мы все.
Crimean Bridge is a patriotic comedy, propaganda camouflaged as a light love story, with the idea that the nation can do anything. It speaks of the great construction project of new times, because a great country must have great construction projects.
В стране должны быть великие стройки.
Krymsky Most, or Crimean Bridge, was written by Margarita Simonyan. As editor-in-chief of state-funded news network RT, Simonyan is one of Russia's most influential journalists, a surprising but ideal candidate to author such a patriotic blockbuster. It's one in a long line released in Russia over the last few years, and it had strong support from the country's top politicians.
Тема Крымского моста – это тема, которая касается всей страны.
It's clear that Crimea is a subject of national interest, with the Kremlin apparently contributing at least $1.5 million to the rom-com's budget. But this film and the 2017 release of Crimea, or Krim, bombed at the box office.
I think that it's not looking good in terms of box office success for such Crimea-themed films. The state productions about sport are much more successful. But the filmmakers are not interested in the historical facts. Let's take the film Legend 17. The whole plot is about the Soviet victory against the Canadian hockey team. Russia did win that first match, but Canada went on to win the series.
7-3. Это победа, товарищи.
Now that Russia is not always portrayed well abroad, and there's kind of some political adversity between Russia and other countries, society demands some kind of motivation to keep going. And sports and success in sports is one of those aspects where people can really watch a film and get a very positive feeling that, yes, I can do it.
Hollywood productions celebrate the might of the American military. And as Russian cinemas are dominated by Hollywood, I think there is a kind of a feeling among the government officials that there needs to be a response to that, not only militarily in terms of, kind of making new tanks, but also from the point of view of filmmaking, that we should come up with a story that also celebrates the Russian army.
Теперь он знает, как русские любят свою родину.
Crimea and sports are reoccurring themes, but the main vehicle for restoring national pride in Putin's Russia is World War II, what they called the Great Patriotic War. When the Soviet Union fell, an official communist ideology was replaced with nothing. Grappling with this void, Vladimir Putin has made patriotism his watchword.
У нас нет никакой и не может быть никакой другой объединяющей идеи, кроме патриотизма.
The war creates a common heritage for a geographically vast and culturally diverse country, evoking memories of Russia as a great power and defeater of fascism, a narrative that brushes over some inconvenient history, like the non-aggression pact that Stalin pragmatically made with Hitler in 1939, or the ethnic cleansing carried out within the USSR. Under Russia's current Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky, himself the director of the Military Historical Society, that national ideal is being adapted for film. In 2015, the government issued a state decree encouraging the use of patriotic cinema in education. And in February this year, the Ministry of Defense announced its own initiative to produce films that are heroic and patriotic.
I think Russia has been trying to find itself after obviously transitioning from the fall of the Soviet Union into a new country. It's been trying to find its own identity again. and the push for patriotic movies and for kind of a Russian identity is all part of that.
Patriotism is always called for in difficult times, for any country. There's a need to both distract and unite people. The theme of patriotism was displayed constantly in Soviet films. The struggle against the counter-revolutionaries, enemies of the people, as well as the depiction of grand socialist construction projects. We don't like to dwell on our mistakes and failures. We concentrate on victories. This principle of making such state-supported films is being resurrected.
Lenin supposedly called cinemas and circuses the most important arts for attracting the masses. From the early days of the Soviet Union, films needed to be socialist, high quality, and display Soviet superiority. The Politburo both supported and censored artists, and the innovations of Soviet filmmakers, names like Eisenstein, Tsigavertov, and Tarkovsky, became known and celebrated the world over. These days, films no longer hold the media monopoly they once did, but that hasn't stopped the Kremlin from taking an interest in shaping the country's cinematic output. And what Russians are calling kinoskandali, cinema scandals, have grown all too common.
Козёл, у тебя никогда никаких прав не было!
The 2014 Russian film Leviathan won both a Golden Globe and an Oscar nomination. At home, the film was criticised for painting an overly negative picture of Russia. Eventually, a version dubbed with less explicit language was allowed to screen. One that failed to get past the censors was a British film, Armando Iannucci's 2017 satire, The Death of Stalin.
Our General Secretary is lying in a puddle of indignity.
Medinsky, who didn't make himself available for an interview with us, called the film an insulting mockery of the entire Soviet past, and it never made it into Russian theatres. This year, just as the Russian film Lieta was being released around the world, its director Kirill Serebrennikov was under house arrest and then on trial for fraud charges his supporters are calling a crackdown on the arts. And a few months ago, the Ministry of Culture was granted unprecedented control over the direction of Russia's film fund. Even indie film festivals have become a target. Vitaly Mansky's Art Doc Fest was hit by a new licensing reform, forcing both him and his festival to relocate to Latvia.
The Russian state has subjugated all media outlets, the press, the main TV channels, and even the single liberal cable channel Dozhd, which now has a very limited audience. Medinsky took up this tendency and has started to cleanse the whole cultural landscape, destroying everything that allowed the production of alternative content. And naturally, his attention fell on film festivals.
I think recently the government has kind of tried to use scandal and controversy as a tool on all levels, in terms of domestic policy, in terms of forming public opinion, but also kind of internationally. They've actually managed to use even negative representations to their benefit. So basically, as long as they can remain in that spotlight and they can appear to be powerful and impactful, I think they're quite happy with that.
Patriotism is politically useful as a concept because it is malleable. It can change shape to suit purpose. And if these blockbusters are anything to go by, the meaning of patriotism for Russia right now is winning.
And finally, there are changes coming to the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the annual black tie event in Washington when journalists mingle with the politicians they're supposed to cover and keep a safe distance from. Rather than having a comedian come in to roast the powers that be, next year's event will feature an historian who will opine on the subject of free speech, assuming that President Trump's okay with that. Trump was clearly unamused at the last dinner when comedienne Michelle Wolf pulled no punches aimed his way. Who will get the last laugh this time? Will anyone laugh? Should the dinner, at a time when Trump calls the media the enemy of the people, even be a thing? We'll leave you now with some of the highs and lows of past Correspondents' Dinners, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
And then, of course, there's Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been saying that he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising since I just assumed he was running as a joke.
Saw you hanging out with NBA players like Steph Curry, Golden State Warriors. That was cool. That was cool, yeah. You know, it kind of makes sense, too, because both of you like raining down bombs on people from long distances, right?
And of course, we have Sarah Huckabee Sanders. We are graced with Sarah's presence tonight. Every time Sarah steps up to the podium, I get excited because I'm not really sure what we're going to get. You know, a press briefing, a bunch of lies, or divided into softball teams. It's shirts and skins, and this time don't be such a little Jim Acosta.